This week on Historsea, I want to tell you guys a story, and we do love a good shipwreck around here, but this one is bad. In fact, the worst shipwreck in human history, and while it took place in wartime, most of the passengers weren't soldiers, and it didn't hit an iceberg or run up on the rocks. It was torpedoed multiple times. In this week's episode, the tragic story of the civilian cruise liner Wilhelm Gustloff. To understand the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff, we have to go back to January 1945. It was a time of war and chaos and desperate evacuations. World War II was nearing its end, and the Eastern Front was engulfed in fighting between German and Soviet forces. We all know the story of World War II all too well. Germany basically picked a fight with the whole world, and our story today starts as they were losing that fight. On their west came the Allied forces, which fought brutally and pushed the people back into Germany. And if that weren't enough, they also picked a fight with the Soviets, who were now pushing in from the east. The Wilhelm Gustloff cruise liner was constructed in 1933 and was originally going to be named the Adolf Hitler after the newly elected Chancellor of Germany. Hitler was super popular at the time and surely would have loved such a luxurious cruise liner named after him, but he saw an opportunity. Wilhelm Gustloff was a politician. He was a leader of a Swiss branch of the Nazi Party, and he had been assassinated by a Jewish student. Hitler decided to name this mighty cruise liner after him and use him as a martyr and make him look like a hero with this mighty ship bearing his name. This was just Nazi propaganda at its best. Wilhelm Gustloff was constructed by the Blohm and Voss shipyards, measuring 684 feet, or just over 200 meters long, and 77 feet wide, or 24 meters wide, with a capacity of 25,000 gross registered tons, and she was launched on May 5th, 1937. She was the first purpose-built cruise ship for the German labor front and used in a German program called Strength Through Joy. Her purposes were to provide recreational and cultural activities for German functionaries and workers, including concerts and cruises and other holiday trips, and serve as sort of a public relations tool that would present a more acceptable image of the German Third Reich. The Gustloff was a cruise ship at her core. She was built to accommodate about 2,000 people, 400 of them being crew, and she was supposed to go on luxury cruises, and she was appointed with very, very comfortable quarters for her passengers, but she didn't have a class system like many cruise liners of her day with first class and second class and all that stuff. All the rooms aboard this ship were exactly the same size and the same quality to reflect the socialist ideals of Nazi Germany at the time. The Gustloff was launched and made a couple small voyages right out of the gate, but her third voyage was interesting. That's when she left Hamburg on April 1st, 1938 with a group to cruise the North Sea with some other ships, 4 in total. A storm developed with winds over 55 knots that forced the group of ships to part ways and put some space between each other. Meanwhile, an 1,800 gross ton coal freighter named Pegaway was also caught in the storm. Cargo and machinery were being washed from Pegaway's decks in the violent storm, and she lost the ability to maneuver in the storm as it increased in intensity. Within a few hours, she was taking on water and actually starting to sink. At 4 a.m., the captain of the Pegaway issued an SOS distress call when the ship was just off the coast of the Netherlands. The closest of the ships that answered the distress call was the Wilhelm Gustloff, which reached the Pegaway by about 6 a.m. The Gustloff launched one of her lifeboats, lifeboat number 1, with a crew of 12 people on her, under the command of the second officer. And this lifeboat was oar-powered, it didn't have an engine, and it was unable to come alongside the Pegaway in the heavy seas, and it actually got into danger and needed rescuing itself. So, the Gustloff launched lifeboat number 6. This had a crew of 10, and it had an engine. As it was lowered, it started to motor, and it was able to handle the waves a lot better than the other lifeboat. Who'd have thought? After first assisting their shipmates in lifeboat number 1 and sending her back toward the Gustloff, lifeboat number 6 was actually able to pull alongside the Pegaway, and the 19 men on the Pegaway jumped into the water and were hauled into the lifeboat safely, and then they headed back for the Gustloff. Everybody was rescued by about 7:45 a.m. And by now, a Dutch tugboat had arrived, but it was unable to save the Pegaway, which soon rolled onto her port side and sank. Lifeboat number 1 was also still in trouble, and it had been so badly damaged by the waves that its crew climbed back aboard the Gustloff with ladders, and they let lifeboat number 1 go and set her adrift. With the outbreak of World War II, the Wilhelm Gustloff was requisitioned by the German Navy in September of 1939, and it underwent significant modifications to serve its new purpose as sort of a floating sanctuary for refugees and military personnel. Its luxurious interiors were stripped down to accommodate as many people as she could hold. Cabins that were designed for comfort during the leisure cruises were now cramped dormitories with bunks for evacuees fleeing the advancing Soviet forces. From 1940 to 1945, the Gustloff was moored in Poland. It didn't move, and it was operating as a floating barracks for a submarine division there, and it didn't see very much action. Leaving the safe harbor was kind of a bad idea anyway, because the waters along the coast were known to be littered with anti-ship mines to protect Germany from Soviet attack. As the Eastern Front collapsed and Soviet forces pressed further toward German territory, the Germans launched what they called Operation Hannibal. This was an operation of mass exodus of any loyal German soldiers and any civilians from East Prussia, West Prussia, and Pomerania. The need for evacuation was dire, and over 2 million people were living in that area. The Wilhelm Gustloff was called upon to help in that evacuation. The Gustloff was charged with carrying as many soldiers and refugees as she could back west to the safety of Germany, and she began taking on all the soldiers from the submarine base first, and then she began taking on civilians. And at first, a standard registration process was followed. They would take the names and hometowns of everybody who got on board. But after a total of 7,956 registered boarded the ship, they eventually gave up on keeping track, and they just let people aboard. And it's said that over 2,000 more people got on board during the evacuation. So while she was designed to carry some 2,000 people, she now carried over 10,000. The ship was overcrowded with refugees, including women and children and elderly, all desperate to escape the impending Soviet occupation. And to make matters worse, it was January on the Baltic Sea. The freezing winter conditions made the journey even more treacherous. On January 30th, 1945, she departed Poland to head west, overcrowded, overloaded, and freezing cold. And remember, she hadn't been to sea in over 5 years. Some argument on the bridge with the crew ensued. The captain wanted to take the standard route in the deeper waters and run at a very slow speed, just 11 knots. The crew knew that there was a good chance the Baltic Sea was being patrolled by Soviet submarines, and while the Gustloff was not an armed ship of war, there was still a good chance that they would be fired upon as the German military machine began to collapse. The crew argued that she should stick to the coast, and her route in shallower waters would be safer because submarines were less likely to be patrolling there, and that she should run at near her full capable speed because she in fact was much faster than Soviet subs. The captain won out in the argument, though, not wanting to run in the shallow water due to the mines known to protect the coast, at the slower speeds, presumably not to push the ship too hard as she'd been sitting for many years. As the sun set, the captain continued to run slow and didn't activate any of the ship's exterior lights. Slow and quiet would be his way of avoiding the Soviet torpedo subs. If they couldn't see the Wilhelm Gustloff, they couldn't shoot at her. But then there was a problem. The captain got an urgent message. It was apparently from a German mine-sweeping convoy of ships that were headed in their direction, and they asked him to turn on all of the exterior lights so that they would see the Gustloff and avoid a collision. But it was weird because none of the radio operators aboard claimed to receive that message, just the captain. and no one understood where the captain got the message from. But nonetheless, the captain activated all of the bright exterior lights of the ship, an action that would ultimately prove fatal. About an hour after the lights came on, a Soviet submarine got sight of the Gustloff, trudging along at 11 knots out in the open water in the pitch black with all of her lights on. The Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Alexander Marinesko. He spotted them and he took aim. Marinesko maneuvered his sub between the Gustloff and the coast for an attack, and at 9:16 p.m., the S-13 fired, 3 torpedoes away. Now, the Wilhelm Gustloff carried enough lifeboats for about 5,000 people, 11 boats perched on davits on either side of the ship, but still only half of the lifeboats that she would have needed if she were to try to evacuate all of the passengers that she carried that night. The attack struck with devastating force Gustloff's port side, and she immediately began to list heavily over as she took on water, her rail reaching the ice-cold waters of the Baltic. The 11 lifeboats on the starboard side were rendered useless almost immediately because she was unable to launch them leaning so hard to port. One of the torpedoes also hit the crew station forward in the ship, which likely killed immediately most of the people on board who were trained on how to launch those lifeboats and evacuate the ship in some kind of an emergency. Quickly after the attack, the engines failed as well, which cut off all electricity, plunging the ship into total darkness. There was a TV movie made about this disaster in 2008, and one of the most popular stories of the wreck is from one of its survivors, a man called Horst Voigt. He was just 10 years old when he and his mother boarded the Gustloff in Poland under the imminent threat of the Soviet attack, and they rushed onto the boat, but Horst pocketed his trusty Swiss Army knife. And as the ship sunk, Horst and his mother, through great struggle in the darkness of the interior of a ship that was listed over hard to port, they made it to a lifeboat. But as the lifeboat was lowered to the freezing water below, Horst remembers people jumping onto the boat, overcrowding it before it was even lowered all the way, and no room was left inside. When they reached the water, more people were grabbing the rails on the sides and trying to pull themselves inboard, threatening to sink the entire ship. There was almost 100 people on it already. The people in the water were just clamoring for refuge, and they were beaten over the head with paddles to stop them from overturning the lifeboat. It was a gruesome scene. And then another problem presented itself. The lines used to lower the lifeboat quickly became frozen, and they were unable to untie themselves from the sinking Wilhelm Gustloff. As she sank, she would bring the lifeboat down with her. They needed to cut those ropes, and they needed to do it quickly. Horst remembered, though, his Swiss Army knife, and he surrendered it, and they were able to cut the rope, saving some 70 or more people in the process. The Wilhelm Gustloff sank rapidly, leaving thousands struggling in the icy waters. The freezing temperatures and lack of lifeboats made the situation even more dire. Only a fraction of those on board the ship actually survived, making it the deadliest shipwreck in human history, with estimates of over 9,000 souls lost. Today, the Wilhelm Gustloff tragedy is remembered as a poignant reminder of the human cost of war. Several memorials and museums exist to honor the victims and keep their memories alive. The shipwreck remains a symbol of the devastating impact that conflict has on civilian lives. In the aftermath of sinking, there was, of course, an inquiry launched to figure out what happened, but the government in charge of that inquiry happened to be the Nazi Germany government, and of course, that government would soon be gone, and with them gone, the inquiry died as well. The captain died shortly after the war, so he was never held responsible for running in open waters slowly all night with all the lights on. And although the ship was a cruise ship, it had been commandeered by the German Navy and held German soldiers and some military equipment, so it was considered a ship of war on the international stage. So its sinking was viewed by the rest of the world as sort of part of the military conflict, and not the war crime of a sinking of a civilian ship, which killed thousands. Now, we hear about shipwrecks all the time, like the Titanic, and we hear about it a lot because that was an isolated incident and not in a time of war. But we rarely hear about the Wilhelm Gustloff, and why is that? As it turns out, it was for a lot of reasons. At the time of the incident, Germany was evacuating people from all over Europe, and the last thing they wanted to do was incite a panic. There were 3 other cruise liners that had actually been sunk in that evacuation in Operation Hannibal in the Baltic at the time. The Nazis also ran Germany on the basis that perception is sort of reality, and largely just lied about everything to the German people. Controlling the flow of information was controlling the people, and they didn't want anyone to find out that 9,000 Germans had just died at the hands of the Soviet enemy. On the Soviet side of the coin, they could have bragged about it and called it a wartime victory, but the Wilhelm Gustloff was known to be a civilian ship carrying mostly refugees, including many women and children and elderly people. It would have been viewed not as a heroic act of war and the sinking of a mighty warship. It would have been viewed as a horrible tragedy. Also, the captain of the S-13 that fired the torpedoes and did the sinking, Marinesko, he was not someone the Soviets wanted to elevate to some heroic symbol of war. He was under a court-martial at the time for his use of alcohol and some irresponsible behavior. The tragedy of the Gustloff is not forgotten, but not exactly mourned the other way shipwrecks have been. In an interview, a German citizen is quoted as saying, "Germany feels it's inappropriate to ever position themselves as the victims, considering the atrocities that they committed during the war." And that kind of makes sense. Truly, the loss of the Gustloff was the worst tragedy at sea in the history of mankind, but talking about the legacy of Nazi Germany is something the world really hasn't come to grips with, even to this day. So this story doesn't get talked about all too often, and in the grand scheme of things, a world war that claimed some 80 million lives, it can be hard to remember just 9,000. But remembering maritime history is important. This has been another Historsea episode, and I will see you next week.